The first thing I heard was the sound of something heavy hitting wood. Not a knock. Nobody knocks like that. That's the sound of a decision already made. It was 17 inches the morning. I know because the clock on Gloria's side of the bed still had her alarm set for 6:45. And I'd been staring at the red numbers for an hour, the way I'd been doing most nights for the past 16 months. The house was cold, the way old Detroit houses get in January, when the wind comes off the river and finds every gap your grandfather left in the insulation. I sat up the way a man with 30 years of assembly line work sits up slow, crooked, waiting for the hip to decide whether it's going to cooperate. It didn't. The second blow hit. And this one was different. I knew that sound, metal against solid wood. I'd swung enough hammers in my life to know one when it landed. Something deep in my chest went very still. "Dad, open the door, right now," my son's voice. 41 years old and still using the tone he used at 16 when he didn't get what he wanted. Except there was something underneath it now that I had never heard before. Something that had already decided. Something that had no room left in it for reconsideration. I put my feet on the cold floor. Gloria's Christmas tree was still up in the living room. I know. It was January. I'd been meaning to take it down since New Year's. But there was an ornament near the top, a little wooden cardinal she'd found at a craft fair in Ypsilanti the year before her diagnosis. And every time I reached for the plug, I just didn't. Some things you aren't ready to put in a box yet. You just aren't. If you don't open this door in the next 10 seconds, Walter, I swear. And then a second voice. My daughter-in-law, Renata. Just go ahead, Marcus. Just do it. She called me Walter. 12 years of Sunday dinners and holiday visits. 12 years of her calling me Pop or sometimes just nothing at all, the way the younger generation does. And she'd switched to my first name at 17 inches the morning in January with a hammer hitting my door. I'm 68 years old, and I've been reading people since before she was born. I knew exactly what that meant. I knew what kind of night this was going to be. That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I should have had a stroke. A man my age, alone in the dark, a hand out of nowhere. I should have gone right there on the bedroom floor. But I didn't, because I knew that hand. I'd known it my entire life. Don't open it yet, Raymond said. Let them come to you. Don't say a word more than you have to. Let them put it all on the record themselves. I turned around and there was my older brother, standing in the hallway in his old flannel robe with his reading glasses still crooked on his face and his phone held low at his hip, the little red recording dot already burning in the corner of the screen. His gray hair was going in every direction. He looked like a man who'd been pulled out of sleep, but his eyes were completely clear. I want to stop here for a second, because I know how this part sounds. A man says his brother appeared in the hallway in the middle of the night, and I understand why that's a strange detail. Raymond had driven down from Flint 3 days earlier because I'd slipped on my back steps clearing ice, and he'd decided without asking me, in the way Raymond has always done things, that he wasn't comfortable with me being alone in the house. I'd argued. He'd said, "That's fine. I'll sleep on your couch." That was Raymond. That had always been Raymond. The most infuriating and the most reliable person I have ever known. "How long have you been up?" I whispered. "Long enough," he said. "Go open the door, Walt. Open it slow. Don't make any moves they didn't expect. Just let them walk in." The deadbolt was starting to splinter at the frame. I walked to my own front door, slowly. My slippers made that old man's shuffle sound on the hardwood, the sound I used to hear my father make and promised myself I'd never make, and I thought about Gloria, and I thought about the cardinal on the Christmas tree, and I undid the chain, and I turned the bolt, and I opened the door. Marcus was standing on my porch in a black hoodie and no coat. 41 degrees. He didn't seem to feel it. The hammer was in his right hand, the head resting on the porch boards. His wife was behind him, her phone up and pointed directly at my face, not filming the scene, filming me, specifically my face, like she was already preparing an exhibit, like she needed footage of how I looked when I agreed to something. I didn't say anything. Raymond had told me not to. "Took long enough," my son said, and still I said nothing. "You're going to let us in," he said, "and you're going to sign some papers. And then this whole thing is done." Renata stepped forward past him. She gave me a look I can only describe as businesslike. "We tried to do this the right way, Walter. We gave you every opportunity." She glanced back at Marcus, and he pushed past me into the house. He did not take off his shoes. He tracked salt and slush onto the rug that Gloria had found at an estate sale in Grosse Pointe, and had been so pleased about she'd sent me a photo from the car before she'd even gotten it home. I had to stand there and watch my son's boots ruin that rug, and I had to not say a word. They sat down at my kitchen table like it was theirs. Marcus set the hammer on the table between us, right there on the wood, like a centerpiece, like a serving dish, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Sit down, Pop." He used Pop. Even then, even with the hammer on the table, "We need to talk about the lake house." Of course it was the lake house. Of course it was. 1,400 square feet on the western shore of Lake Erie, just past the Monroe County line, down a gravel road my father had driven his truck down every summer weekend from 1961 until his knees gave out. My grandfather had poured the foundation. My father had built the walls. I had put the roof on with my own hands the summer I was 23 years old, and I have the scar on my left forearm from the nail gun to prove it. Every one of my children had learned to swim off that dock. There was a height chart penciled on the inside of the back bedroom door, Marcus's, Mark's, and his sister Tanya's, every July from when they were 4 years old. That house was not a property. That house was a record of lives lived. It had also, as of the last appraisal Gloria and I had done just before her diagnosis, been worth somewhere north of $900,000. "What about it?" I said. "You're going to sign it over to us." Marcus leaned back in the chair. "We had the paperwork drawn up. It's clean. You sign tonight, it transfers, and that's the end of it." "The end of what?" He smiled. It was not a smile I recognized. "Come on, Pop. We both know you've been slipping. The fall last week, the time you left your truck running in the driveway for 2 hours, forgetting Renata's birthday, forgetting appointments. I want to tell you what it feels like to sit across from your own child and hear him tell you your mind is going. Even if it isn't true, especially if it isn't true, there's a moment where your whole body goes quiet, like something inside you is listening to see if maybe, just maybe, he's right. That's what they count on. That silence, that involuntary doubt. "We've got a physician," Renata said. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed. "He's reviewed your situation, and he's prepared to provide documentation for the competency filing. Combined with the bank records and the neighbor statements, it's a strong case." "What neighbor statements?" "Mr. Kowalski next door," she said. "He confirmed the truck incident and a few other things." I thought about Ted Kowalski next door. 70 years old, retired auto worker, man I'd had coffee with on his driveway every spring for 15 years. I tried to picture Ted agreeing to say something that wasn't true about me. Something didn't fit. "We've already met with the attorney," Marcus said. "If you don't sign tonight, we file Monday. Guardianship proceeding. And once that goes through, and it will go through, we've got the medical, we've got the documentation, everything gets administered through us. The house, the lake house, your pension, your savings. It all gets run through a guardianship account while the legal process moves, which costs money, money from your estate. So the smart thing, the thing that keeps the most in the family, is to just handle this tonight," he said, "in the family." The audacity of that phrase, sitting at his mother's kitchen table with a sledgehammer in January, telling me the family would be better served if I handed him his mother's inheritance right now in the middle of the night. I wanted to say 17 things. I could feel every one of them crowding up behind my teeth. I pressed my hands flat on the table and I said nothing. That is when Raymond walked out of the hallway. He came around the corner with the same unhurried walk he'd had his entire life. Phone held up just enough that the lens could see the whole kitchen, the red dot still running. He stopped at the end of the table and he looked at my son, the way a man looks at something he's been expecting and is not afraid of. "Marcus," he said. "Renata." He nodded once at each of them. "I want you to know that this phone has been recording since the moment your father got up from his bed tonight. Audio, video, it's been streaming live to a cloud account that my attorney in Flint has had access to since this conversation started. Which means that even if you pick that hammer up right now and put it through the phone, what's already been recorded is already saved." In 3 separate locations, my daughter-in-law lowered her phone slowly. "Your physician," Raymond continued, and his voice was perfectly calm. The voice of a man who has had this speech ready for months and is finally allowed to give it. "I believe you're referring to Dr. Hargrove out of Downriver Medical. I had a conversation last Tuesday with the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. An informal conversation. They were very interested to hear that Dr. Hargrove has been providing written capacity assessments for patients he has never personally examined. Apparently, the licensing board moves quite quickly when there's documentation of that pattern. Marcus had gone the color of drywall. Your attorney, Raymond went on. He sent your father a letter in October, informing him of the guardianship preparation. Standard procedure. Your father brought me that letter when I was down here for Thanksgiving. I took it to my lawyer in Flint, who took it to a colleague here in Wayne County, who specializes in elder financial abuse. They have been building a file since November. What kind of file? Marcus said. His voice had changed. It was smaller now. The bank statements you submitted to the attorney showing erratic withdrawals and confused spending on your father's part. We have the originals from Flagstar. They don't match, not even close. Federal wire fraud statute covers document falsification submitted to facilitate guardianship proceedings. That's not a state charge, Marcus. That's a federal charge. Renata made a sound I will never forget. It was very small and very specific, the sound of a person who realizes the room they built in their mind doesn't have the exits they thought it had. Mr. Kowalski, Raymond continued, I had him over for coffee on Saturday. Very pleasant man. He told me that Marcus had come to his door 6 weeks ago and asked him to put in writing that he'd witnessed erratic behavior from Walter, leaving appliances running, walking in the street at odd hours. Mr. Kowalski told me he'd refused because none of those things were true. He also told me he'd written down the date and time of Marcus's visit because something about it made him uncomfortable. He was happy to provide a sworn affidavit, which he did. That was the moment. That was when I felt my son understand that he was not going to walk out of this house with what he came for. I watched it move across his face, not guilt, not yet. First it was calculation, then it was fear, and then finally, underneath it all, something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who has been holding an enormous lie up over his head for a very long time and has finally run out of strength to hold it. The lake house, Raymond said. The reason you drove here at 1 a.m. with a hammer, it has been held in an irrevocable family trust since 2017. Gloria and Walter established it the month after her first oncology appointment. It cannot be sold. It cannot be transferred. It cannot be refinanced or borrowed against. On your father's death, it passes in full to your sister Tanya with the provision that you and your children are entitled to use it for 2 weeks every summer for as long as you live. He paused. Your father may want to revisit that provision after tonight. Marcus stood up. His hand moved toward the hammer. I watched Raymond's eyes go to the phone, steady and unblinking, and I watched my son see that, and I watched his hand stop. You should go, I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since they sat down. My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I was glad for it. Dad, take the hammer with you. You don't understand what we were trying to... You should go, I said again. Both of you. Renata's face had changed by then. The fear had burned off and left something harder underneath. You're going to be alone in this house, she said. And when you need someone and nobody comes, you'll wish you'd thought about this differently. Raymond moved to the door and opened it. Get out of my brother's house, he said. And for the first time that night, his voice had something in it beyond calm. Something that had its own kind of edge. They left. Marcus didn't look at me. Renata did, and the look she gave me as she walked out is something I'll carry until I die. It was pure hatred, not the messy, passionate kind, the cold kind, the kind that belongs to a person who got caught and has already started rewriting the story in their head to make themselves the victim of the people who stopped them. The door closed. Raymond turned the deadbolt. We stood there in my kitchen for a moment. The Christmas tree blinked its white lights from the corner. The cardinal ornament caught the light. Raymond sat down where my son had been sitting. He put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Sometimes that's the right thing, just to hold something together in the silence while the worst of it passes through. Eventually, I said, how long have you known? June, he said. June. I had to let that land. Gloria called me in May. The week before she went into hospice. He paused, and I could see this cost him something to say. She'd been worried for a while. She told me that Marcus had been asking questions about the lake house, about the will, about your finances. She said the questions had a feeling to them that she didn't like. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd keep an eye on you. I didn't say anything. She didn't want you to know, he said. She didn't want you spending her last weeks worrying about this. She wanted you to be there with her. Just with her. I want to be honest with you. I don't have words for what I felt in that moment. My wife had been dying, and she had used some part of her last remaining energy that was precious and finite, and almost gone to make a phone call to protect the man she was leaving behind. She hadn't protected herself from what was coming. She'd protected me from something that was still a year away, from something I hadn't even seen yet. That is the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. That's the kind that just quietly does the thing that needs doing and doesn't wait for credit. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, and I cried for my wife, and I cried for my son, and I cried for the version of my life I had believed I was living, the version where the people you build everything with are building alongside you. I cried until I didn't have anything left. Raymond kept his hand over mine the whole time. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't say anything that wasn't true. He just stayed. The next 8 weeks were harder than the weeks when Gloria was dying. That's not something I expected to be able to say. But grief has a shape to it. You know what it is and why it's there. What followed was different. The the FBI, out of the Detroit field office moved faster than Raymond's attorney had prepared me for. The forged bank documents were the easiest piece. The digital paper trail was extensive. The medical licensing complaint against Dr. Hargrove took longer. Eventually, his license was suspended pending investigation, and from what I understand, he's currently doing something in Florida that has nothing to do with medicine. Marcus was charged with bank fraud and filing false instruments to a court proceeding. Renata was charged with the same counts, plus an additional charge related to false submissions to the guardianship attorney. They both pleaded guilty. Marcus received 22 months. Renata received 2 years less a day with conditions. Their 2 children, my granddaughters, 8 and 11 years old, went to live with Renata's mother in Lansing for the duration. I have seen them twice. They look at me through eyes that have been filled with someone else's version of things. I don't try to argue with what they've been told. They're children. The truth has a way of finding people eventually, and if it doesn't, that's not something I can fix. My daughter Tanya flew in from Portland the day after everything happened. She showed up at my door at 7 p.m. with her husband and her youngest, and a look on her face that told me she'd been crying on the plane. She said she was staying until I told her to leave. She stayed 4 weeks. We took down the Christmas tree together. She helped me go through Gloria's winter coats, which I had been unable to face for 16 months. Her youngest daughter, Avery, is 8 years old and has her grandmother's eyes and the alarming confidence of someone who has no idea yet that the world doesn't always cooperate. One night I had a bad dream and woke up crying, and Avery heard me through the wall, and she came into my room in her pajamas and sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand until I fell back asleep. I don't know what I did to deserve that child, but I am grateful for her every day of my life. Raymond stayed for another 6 weeks after Tanya left. He cooked, he shoveled. He drove me to the attorney's office twice and to my cardiologist once. In the evenings we watched basketball, the Pistons, who did exactly what the Pistons do in winters like that. In March, when the snow started pulling back from the driveway, he packed his truck and said he was heading home to Flint. I told him I'd rather he stayed. He said no. He said a man needs to learn who he is without someone to lean on, and that I'd been doing it wrong for a while, leaning on Gloria for 41 years, and then leaning on grief for 16 months, and it was time to try standing up on my own and see what that felt like. He was right. He was always right. That was the most irritating thing about him, and I have loved him for it every day of my life. I changed my will that spring. Tanya receives both the house and the lake house. The trust conditions on the lake house remain, giving Marcus's children access during 2 summer weeks annually, but only after Marcus has served his sentence and submitted a written statement acknowledging the specific harm he caused. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm not boarding up the door either. Those are my grandchildren. Gloria would have wanted some kind of door left open, even a narrow one. I joined a bowling league in April. I'd bowled in my 20s, stopped, and spent 30 years forgetting how much I'd loved the feel of it. There's a man in the league named Earl, retired electrician, quiet, dry sense of humor that sneaks up on you, who has become something like a friend. We have coffee on Thursday mornings at a diner on East Jefferson. We don't talk about what happened. He knows. Most people in the league know. They don't bring it up, and I appreciate them for it. Avery calls me on video chat every Sunday. She shows me her drawings. She told me last month that she wants to learn to fish when she visits in July, and I told her we'd go out on the lake and I'd teach her everything I know, which is probably not much because I'm a better storyteller than I am a fisherman. She said that sounded good. I think about that night sometimes. The hammer against the wood, the sound of my son's voice with that new cold thing in it, the way he laid that hammer on his mother's kitchen table. I think about how easily it could have ended differently if Raymond hadn't been sleeping on my couch, if Gloria hadn't made that call from her hospice bed, if Ted Kowalski next door had been a different kind of man and had signed what my son asked him to sign. And here's what I've come to understand. What happened to my son wasn't sudden. People don't arrive at 1 a.m. sledgehammer decisions without a long, quiet road of smaller decisions that came before it. He had convinced himself, over years, that he was owed something, that he was the loyal one, the one who stayed close, the one who showed up. He'd been keeping score in a ledger nobody else knew existed. And by the time he stood on my porch in the cold, that ledger had grown so large in his mind that he couldn't see past it to what he was actually doing. That's the thing about dishonesty. It never announces itself as dishonesty. It shows up dressed as practicality, as fairness, as being realistic about what other people can handle. You tell yourself one small story that isn't quite true, and then you build a slightly larger one on top of it, and before long you're living in a house made of things you made up and you've forgotten what the ground underneath it actually feels like. My wife understood that. She saw it coming when I was too close to see anything. And she didn't have a lot left by May. She really didn't, but what she had, she spent on a phone call to my brother. Not to say goodbye, not to settle anything for herself. Just to make sure the man she was leaving behind had someone watching his back. Honestly, when I think about that, when I really sit with what she did, I don't have a category for it. It is the quietest and most complete act of love I have ever witnessed in my life. And I got to be married to the woman who did it for 41 years. Some men get very lucky without ever quite knowing it. I was one of those men for a long time. If you've ever felt like the people you built your life with were supposed to be building alongside you, and then one day you found out that wasn't entirely true, then you know exactly what kind of night that January night was. And if you felt that, I want you to know, the person who saves you usually isn't the person you expected. It's usually the person who's been quietly paying attention. The one who drove 4 hours without being asked and slept on your couch and didn't make a thing of it. Pay attention to those people. Tell them what you notice before you need their help. And for the love of everything, if your gut is telling you something is wrong, call someone you trust. Don't wait until a hammer is hitting your door. Here's the one thing I want to leave you with. If you've made it all the way here with me, your dignity is not something the world keeps safe for you. It is something you have to carry yourself all the way to the end. And there will be a night, it might be nothing like my night. It might be something quieter and slower and harder to name when someone tries to take it from you. Maybe someone you trusted, maybe someone you raised. What I learned that January is that the only person who can refuse to hand it over is you. And the refusal doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand completely still. Keep your hands flat on the table and let the other person say everything they came to say into a camera that's already recording. Courage isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's just the plain refusal to move. So I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to take a second and actually think about it. If you had been the one at that table, what would you have done? Would you have signed? Would you have stayed calm? I genuinely want to know. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think you'd have held your ground, a 2 if you think you'd have struggled but stayed, or a 3 if you're willing to be honest and say that at 2 a.m. with a hammer on the table, you might have signed just to end it. There's no wrong answer. And while you're down there, tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there, because this channel reaches people in places I still find remarkable. And if something about this story hit close to home, if you've experienced your own version of that kitchen table, I'd be honored if you shared it. You don't have to use real names. If this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. I tell stories like this one because I believe that the most important things are usually the ones that happen in the middle of the night, in kitchens, between people who love each other or who used to. Those are the stories that tell us who we actually are. And I'm not going anywhere. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. fully rewritten and reimagined in Detroit, Michigan to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to actual events, is entirely coincidental.